Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, I've made a lot of videos on this channel talking about the benefits of finasteride. Sometimes I even get accused of being biased towards finasteride, which I always found to be pretty funny, because just think about that claim for a moment. I run a hair loss channel, and people try to criticize me for being biased towards finasteride. You know, the most clinically proven treatment that has ever been developed for treating hair loss. You might as well criticize a bodybuilding YouTuber for being biased for promoting the barbell squat as an effective movement to develop your leg muscles. So, of course I am pro-finasteride, but that doesn't mean I am dishonest about either its benefits or its risk. In fact, I've made several videos where I put the risk of finasteride in the foreground, such as this video titled What to Do If You Get Side Effects from Finasteride. I have always been completely honest about the reality of finasteride side effects. It is a prescription pharmaceutical drug after all, and downplaying the risks such as saying that side effects never happen would be just as foolish and misinformed as claiming that everybody gets side effects. When I discuss finasteride's risk profile, I don't do so using things like conjecture or speculation. I do so by weighing the best scientific information that is available. However, one very common talking point from finasteride haters and DHT simps online is that people like me understate the risk of side effects and that side effects from finasteride are actually far greater than what the research shows. Many will even go further than this and claim that the risk of getting side effects from finasteride is actually very high, but this reality is being kept secret by a big pharma conspiracy. There is no evidence for this conspiracy theory whatsoever, but nevertheless, finasteride has been subject to a fairly successful gaslighting campaign over the years, which has led many people to believe this baseless claim. What's especially sad is that much of this misinformation actually comes from communities that are supposed to help people stop hair loss, such as skeptical posts like this one that appeared on the Trestless subreddit. Also, from time to time you see articles appear on the internet that claim that the side effects of finasteride and dutasteride are understated. Even though these articles go completely against the medical mainstream, finasteride haters will still accept every word as gospel and show no skepticism whatsoever. So unfortunately, there is a lot of confusion about this subject. Finasteride has become the focal point of a culture war propagated mostly by far-right conspiracy theorists and internet tough guys. They want you to believe that DHT is some super important hormone that is vital to male virility because that makes it a lot easier to convince people that DHT suppressing drugs becoming mainstream is part of some big pharma plot by the woke left to feminize men and to weaken society so that we can be easily conquered by the Jewish lizard people from Proxima Centauri. In reality, though, there is nothing political at all about finasteride use. Finasteride isn't about left versus right. No, it is about winners versus losers. The people who use finasteride are largely winners. They include attractive movie stars, male models, professional athletes, bodybuilders, doctors, geniuses. Hell, even US presidents use finasteride. The people who are against finasteride, though, are complete fucking losers. They basically are just a group of terminally online, neck-bearded perma-virgin incels who have to pee in their mother's basement and have Uber Eats deliver them KFC 3 times per day because they can never leave their computer desk for longer than 10 minutes at a time because of their never-ending crusade to win internet arguments against 14-year-olds on Facebook, Fortnite, 4chan, Twitter, YouTube, and World of Warcraft about such thought-provoking subjects like atheism and how Neon Genesis Evangelion is a masterpiece. You will never see any successful or happy anti-finasteride people. Never. They're unhappy because they failed to save their hair, and the only thing that brings them any solace is the hope that their seething rants against finasteride may perhaps convince other people not to take it, and thus ensure other people will be doomed to spend the rest of their lives behind a computer screen, forever getting triggered by Disney movies, Brie Larson tweets, Star Wars female leads, minorities in video games, and other things that people who have a life outside of social media don't care about. So, in order to make other people as unhappy as they are, they have to convince the world that finasteride is far too dangerous of a drug to even consider using, and that DHT is a critically important hormone for male virility. That narrative quickly falls apart, though, once you take into account the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who take finasteride don't get any side effects at all. After all, if DHT were so critically important, then why would only 2% or so of people get side effects from finasteride if it suppresses serum DHT levels by 70%? If men suppress 70% of their testosterone levels, then 100% of them would get side effects, and probably right away. So the way they counter this is by claiming that the rate of side effects is severely underreported and that big pharma is covering it up, and the only reason why we don't see this is because we're woke cucks who get our news from CNN instead of Alex Jones and the Ray Pete forums. So what's the reality here? Do these basement dwellers from the intellectual dork web have any real data to back up their claims, or are they just as wrong as they usually are? Well, let's take a look at the research, hair loss witchers. So first of all, let's take a look at that article again that claimed that finasteride and dutasteride side effects are underestimated. If you click on the link of the article, it brings you to the scientific research that the article is based on. Well, here's the study that the article makes reference to, and it is from our old friend Dr. Traish. In case you haven't been following this channel closely, Dr. Traish is a major player here in the Haircafe cinematic universe. He's basically the equivalent of Thanos, since any finasteride hater thinks they can simply just snap their fingers and link one of his studies to then magically legitimize any of their arguments against finasteride. Dr. Traish is one of the biggest, if not the biggest pushers of the post-finasteride conspiracy theory on the planet, which puts him in the extreme fringe on the medical community, since the overwhelming majority of doctors do not believe post-finasteride syndrome is a real thing. And I made a video about that, which I'll link below. And since we're on the subject of post-finasteride syndrome, I'll go ahead and link my entire video series on the subject below too. So Dr. Traish is no stranger on this channel. I've mentioned him and his work many times, but what many people may not realize is that Dr. Traish is not even a dermatologist. Rather, he is a member of the Department of Urology at Boston University. However, he is not a practicing urologist either, because he is not a medical doctor at all. Instead, he has a PhD in biochemistry and a master's degree in business administration, as you can read on his website. This is not to detract from his credentials for doing research, but it is obvious that he has made a career out of bashing 5-AR blockers, while at the same time, he has never actually treated any actual patients with 5-AR blockers for either enlarged prostate or hair loss, since he is not an actual medical doctor. Also, if you look at his articles published over the last decade or so, they seem to get more and more shrill and strident in their titles as time passes. He starts out back in 2012 with a pretty innocuous title, quote, 5 alpha reductase in human physiology, an unfolding story, unquote. And then we see the article we just saw titled, quote, adverse effects of 5 alpha reductase inhibitors. What do we know, don't know, and need to know, unquote. However, he starts turning to the dark side with the next article titled, quote, the dark side of 5-AR inhibitor therapy, unquote. Then he moves on to, quote, post-finasteride syndrome, a surmountable challenge for clinicians, unquote. By the next article, though, I guess he decided it wasn't a surmountable challenge anymore, and now he throws dutasteride under the bus too, with this article titled, quote, health risk associated with long-term finasteride and dutasteride use. It's time to sound the alarm, unquote. I get linked this goddamn article all the time. Even in the videos where I do not talk about finasteride, I'll often have someone post a link to the study and leave some snide comment like, oh yeah, Kevin, well this study confirms your findings on finasteride are wrong, and you clearly are downplaying the risk of side effects, so haha. Anyways, all Dr. Traish's articles are pretty repetitive, so let's get back to the article he published in 2015 I showed before that claimed that finasteride side effects were underreported. Around the time that article was published, another article was published on the online journal Vice, and it was a bunch of anecdotes of people who were suing Merck for supposed post-finasteride syndrome. It was basically a very negative hit piece that tried to milk sympathy for the supposed victims of finasteride. But even in this article, where the reporters would have loved to get some negative input from actual doctors, they could not find any practicing doctors who actually agreed that finasteride caused the side effects the article was claiming. The actual doctors in the article said that they never saw a case of persistent side effects even once. You can see for yourself in this quote here. One of the urologists interviewed for the article even noted that it was very strange that finasteride side effects occurred more often in young people on just 1 milligram per day for hair loss than in older men who were on 5 milligrams per day for an enlarged prostate. With most drugs, the incidence of side effects goes up when the dose goes up. In fact, the same doctor raises the issue of social contagion as a cause of increased reporting of finasteride side effects and supposedly persistent side effects. There is such a thing as a nocebo effect, and the more worried you are about getting side effects because you are immersed in online negative experiences with finasteride, the more likely you will get a nocebo effect when starting the drug. I talked about that in my video titled How to Stop Worrying About Finasteride Side Effects and Avoid the Nocebo Effect, and I'll go ahead and link that video below. So, post-finasteride syndrome is not driven by any solid clinical evidence. Rather, it is driven by very loud voices, lawsuits, and PhD researchers like Dr. Traish online. The actual people taking care of patients don't buy it at all, though, and I talked about this more in my video on the subject, which I'll link below. So, Is there anything in the Dr. Traish article from 2015 to support the claim that finasteride side effects are underreported? Well, the article first makes the claim that there are non-sexual side effects of finasteride, including diabetes, psychosis, depression, and problems with cognition, and it claims that these side effects are underappreciated. The article also claims that the sexual side effects can be persistent. However, to support these claims, Dr. Traish just relies on theoretical effects of 5-AR blockade. He writes several pages saying why the blockade of the 5-AR enzyme might in theory cause problems. In this part of the paper, Dr. Traish, he tosses out several red herrings. For example, he brings up neurosteroid synthesis, he brings up that there are a total of 5 different 5-AR isoenzymes, he brings up the importance of DHT for development in utero and during early puberty, blah blah blah, you get the idea. All of this is irrelevant, as I have pointed out many times before. Let's start with neurosteroid synthesis. Neurosteroid production in the human brain isn't affected by finasteride. The predominant isoenzyme in the brain is the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme, which finasteride only has a negligible effect on. Dutasteride is a type 1 5-AR blocker, but it also doesn't cause any neurological side effects, and that might be because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. The 5 isoenzymes of 5-AR are also irrelevant, since other than the type 1 and type 2 isoenzymes, these isoenzymes don't affect steroid synthesis. I talk about that in my video on the type 3 5-AR isoenzyme that I'll link below, so make sure you watch that if you haven't seen it yet. Finally, nobody is arguing that DHT is a trash hormone before puberty, so this is another red herring straw man argument. The argument is that in adulthood, DHT has no real benefits and it only causes problems like acne, an enlarged prostate, and hair loss. So, at least half the paper is completely theoretical. It isn't until the 6th page of the paper that Dr. Traish gets into the adverse effects of 5-AR inhibiting drugs. So, in this part, Dr. Traish is forced to concede that the data from the large randomized controlled studies make finasteride look pretty good. In the PLUS study of patients with benign prostatic hyperplasia, there was a higher percentage of dropouts in the placebo control group than in the finasteride group, with a 42% dropout rate with placebo versus only 34% with finasteride. However, Dr. Traish then makes the claim that the sexual side effects of finasteride and dutasteride are underreported, and he bases his claim on this article here. We'll get to that article in a minute, but let's wrap up Dr. Traish's trashy article first. So, as usual, Dr. Traish relies heavily on animal studies, mostly rodent studies, to imply that finasteride is important for brain function and erectile function. I've addressed all these studies in my previous videos on finasteride's effects on neurosteroids, brain function, and sexual function, and I'll link those videos below if you haven't seen them yet. He then lists the clinical studies of finasteride and dutasteride and concludes that both drugs can cause more side effects than placebo. Of course, this is no big revelation at all, and no one is arguing that the drugs don't cause any sexual side effects in anyone, but when comparing the incidence of sexual side effects in men on 5-AR blockers versus men just taking a placebo treatment, the difference is just a few percentage points, not anywhere near as high as you would expect if DHT was really critical for sexual health. The reason people get side effects on finasteride is not even because of lower DHT levels. Instead, it is because of finasteride's effects on the ratio of testosterone to estrogen, which finasteride alters, and I'll link the video where I discuss that below. But it's very important to emphasize once again that side effects of any sort from finasteride are a rarity. So, after bringing up the anecdotal reports of persistent side effects from finasteride, Dr. Traish is forced to admit that in the PLUS trial, which is a trial of over 3,000 men randomized to finasteride at 5 mg per day versus a placebo, that there was no evidence that sexual side effects persisted any more in finasteride subjects than in subjects on placebo. For the rest of the paper, Dr. Traish goes back to animal research for the most part, making claims about the theoretical adverse effects of 5-AR inhibiting drugs on cardiovascular function, diabetes, and brain function, all of which I've debunked many times in different videos, so let's move on from this paper. So, instead, let's take a look at the paper that Dr. Traish cites to support his claim that the side effects are underreported. It is this paper here, also published in 2015. So, it turns out I already discussed this paper briefly in my Post-finasteride syndrome as a fairy tale video, which I'll link below, but let's take a second look at it anyways. The authors of the study looked at 2 previous large meta-analyses of finasteride trials. One of the meta-analyses found, quote, no significant difference between active treatment and placebo for the outcome global sexual disturbance, unquote. The other meta-analysis found that, quote, the only adverse effect that was significantly more frequent with finasteride therapy in comparison to placebo treatment was erectile erectile dysfunction. However, only 1 of every 80 patients treated will experience erectile dysfunction, unquote. Those results apparently weren't good enough for the authors of this paper though, so of course they wanted to find a way to make finasteride look worse than it appears in these clinical studies. So the way to do that was first to do a literature search and identify as many clinical studies of finasteride as possible, including studies with low numbers of subjects that were done for reasons other than to assess the safety of finasteride. The investigators then classified the reports of adverse effects in these papers as either adequate, partially adequate, or inadequate. The investigators defined a study as adequate if the study used a specific toxicity scale to grade adverse events and reported exact numbers and percentages of each specific adverse event. So for example, a study that lumped together low libido and erectile dysfunction into one category of sexual dysfunction would not be considered an adequate study. Even a study that didn't lump together different symptoms would still not be considered adequate if it didn't judge something like libido using something like a 0 to 10 scale. If the study just asked a yes or no question about whether you develop low libido while using the drug, it wouldn't be judged an adequate study by this new standard. Studies were considered partially adequate or inadequate if fewer details were reported than were required by this new standard. So it is interesting that applying this new standard wouldn't actually change the percentage of side effects in these studies. Whether or not you lump together side effects or rate side effects using a point scale doesn't actually change the overall percentage of side effects. So this analysis doesn't actually show the side effects were underreported in any studies. It is just criticizing the quality of the reporting of these side effects. Anyways, here are all the studies that were evaluated by these criteria. So the results were that of the 34 articles reviewed, supposedly none of them had adequate safety reporting, 56% had partially adequate reporting, and 35% had inadequate reporting, at least by the standard used in this study. So what can you make out of this analysis? Well, first of all, it's not surprising at all that if you change the goalpost on how clinical studies are assessed, you will find many studies that don't meet the new criteria. In the study here that used the same criteria and applied them to 192 drug trials of different drugs, only 29% of the trials met the criteria for adequate safety reporting. Also, there is a big difference between reporting side effects in a study and the actual monitoring of side effects by the investigators during the study. During large clinical trials designed to obtain approval of new drugs by the FDA, there is very meticulous monitoring of side effects. Also, the FDA will continuously review patient safety data as the study is ongoing to make sure that a drug is safe for approval. There is an immense amount of data collected during a randomized clinical trial, and all of it is reviewed by a special committee known as the Safety Monitoring Committee, and it is made up of doctors who are not affiliated with the study. This committee has access to all the reports on adverse effects. They even have the power to stop the study if it appears there is any risk from the new drug. So, when a study is published, all the raw study data needs to be summarized, and so some of the details are summarized too. It is true that studies done today may be more meticulous in the reporting of data than studies done in the 1990s when finasteride was first studied, but that is true of all the studies of that period. It doesn't invalidate any of those studies. Also, like I said, the new criteria used in this paper just aims to provide more detail about the side effects that occurred, but that doesn't change the overall number or percentage of side effects. It doesn't mean that the side effects were missed at all. Finally, these authors included many small studies of finasteride that weren't intended to evaluate the safety of the drug, so this makes the number of inadequate studies appear worse than if they had just included the largest clinical trials of the drug. So this whole idea that somehow the original investigators missed the side effects or unreported the side effects of finasteride is just flat out wrong. At worst, they didn't provide enough information to satisfy these new, totally made up standards that didn't even exist when the studies were done. What a big surprise. So, despite the attempts of Dr. Traish to cloud the issue and make it seem like finasteride side effects were underreported in the original studies, there is absolutely no evidence that that is true. The study we just went over doesn't even say that. It just says that the standards for reporting adverse events should provide more detail, but that doesn't mean that any adverse events were underreported at all. Despite that, people including Dr. Traish himself had completely misinterpreted the study from 2015, which has led to the widespread misconception that finasteride side effects were underreported in the original clinical studies of finasteride. Bottom line though, chooms, is that this is nonsense. The people who are spreading these myths likely don't even believe in their own bullshit. They say these lies anyways though, because their happiness is contingent on your failures, because nothing makes them more unhappy than hearing stories of people having a good experience while on finasteride, because it reinforces their own failures. These finasteride haters, they don't care about you. When they tell you to stay away from finasteride, they're not saying it for your sake, they're saying it for their own sake. But these losers are not worth losing your hair over. They're miserable people, and misery loves company. You don't deserve to be miserable like they are, though, because unlike them, you had the grit, guts, and balls to make the tough decisions about hair loss that they couldn't. So take your finasteride, enjoy your hair, and enjoy your life because you've earned it, chums. God bless.